So, to those of you that weren't here last week, let me just do a brief introduction. And it's okay that you weren't here last week. That's the other thing that's really important. The way that I'm presenting this each kind of evening is a standalone chapter, if you will, in terms of exploring substance use disorders, etc. And then the role that family has and loved ones have in terms of trying to help someone in their life. So the fact that you weren't here last week is not a negative in the slightest bit. So I'm Gerard. I was very politely introduced as Dr. Love. It sounds really impressive. It doesn't impress me because my father was Dr. Love and two of my brothers Dr. Love, and so I've grown up hearing it. But I just go by my first name Gerard, which is a lot easier. So if you have a question, for me, I'm more than happy to talk with any of you whenever we're finished or answer any questions. You can just call me Gerard. So I've worked in the field. It's hard. I was calculating. Michael was off whenever he introduced me last week, but you could never tell by looking at this. But it is over 40 years that I've worked in the drug and alcohol field. Over 40. So if you start doing the math, you can kind of figure out how old I am since I started in my 20s working in the field. So I'm an older person and I'm surviving working in the field for so long. But this is the only field that I've ever worked in. I've worked in it in a variety of different ways. I've trained addiction counselors. I've been a family therapist, a treatment team coordinator. I've worked in employee assistance programming. If you're familiar with that, that's basically kind of little mental health units in the world of work that historically came out of the world of drug and alcohol counseling. That's kind of their initial focus. And I worked, two of my most recent positions, I worked at University of Alabama where I ran their outpatient drug and alcohol counseling program. It was separate from the University Counseling Center. And I also ran their drug court with the assistance of a judge. It was an on-campus drug court, an in-house drug testing lab, which was in our offices, which was really, it's sort of a cutting-edge thing for it to be there. And not to get into the weeds, but just to give you an example about how effective it is, that we would have someone come in, pee in a cup, and they would go off to meet with their counselor for the first time based upon some infraction of the code of conduct and smiling and denying everything, and then the lab results, within 11 minutes, the lab results would pop up on the clinician's laptop, and it's let's talk about cocaine, or let's talk about Xanax, or let's talk about, oh my gosh, some interesting stuff is popped up, and so then there was always that aha moment. It's oh, okay, well, yeah, so maybe, I don't know, strange that it's there, but so it was a really fascinating kind of setup. But my favorite part at the University of Alabama was that at the end of a hall we had collegiate recovery. And collegiate recovery programs are designed for college students who have been off to treatment, who made the decision to be drug and alcohol free. Ours was abstinence based, so they needed to be 100% drug and alcohol free. I had students as early as freshman fall semester, and then I had students that had been there that were working on their masters and their doctorates who had as many as 6 and 7+ years of sobriety. But they still wanted and sought the support and the reinforcement from being a part of a collegiate recovery program. I previously developed a collegiate recovery program at another institution. So I have a real passion for that because it's the good side of drug and alcohol and substance use disorders whenever a person finds recovery and they find sobriety, because they're just absolutely wonderful. And we just, I did tons of fundraising so we could have every possible thing that any other student on campus had access to, only theirs was in a safe space. Because college campuses, not just University of Alabama, right, because they're, it's a big school, big Greek life system there, but most schools are relatively toxic environments for a person who doesn't want to drink alcohol or use substances. It's just the way it is in our culture, unfortunately. So anyway, collegiate recovery is definitely a passion of mine. And then I've worked recently in inpatient drug and alcohol treatment, and presently, which I have been for several years, I work for Hazelton Betty Ford out of Center City, Minnesota, where right now I'm supervising interns for the summer. And then I'm a faculty member there. I teach family therapy, family counseling. So just to kind of give you an idea, in case you're wondering, did Michael just like run down to Caligny, just grab this guy to come in here and talk with you? So just so you have a little bit of information. So what I'd like to do this evening is talk with you about a model that I don't believe you would have ever been exposed to before. But I like it for two different reasons for this particular audience. And then one of them is it helps you understand the journey of your loved one in terms of their substance use disorder. But the person that created this model also uses it for work with families. And so the belief, this model was developed by Stephanie Brown. In case you want to take a look, it's her developmental model of recovery, Stephanie Brown. She is Dr. Stephanie Brown, person in long-term recovery, and I actually use her textbook when I'm teaching family therapy. So it's particularly useful and helpful. But I knew about this model like way before. So the original part, this developmental part, really helps explain a lot. And so again, it works really well for understanding the behaviors and the way of thinking of your loved one, but then it also provides a guideline for like a roadmap for what a family member goes through as well. They're two parallel journeys. And I think I concluded last week talking about the importance of that, of people having their own journey and being on their own journey, and then learning how to separate from the person in your life who has the active substance use disorder. That's a really critical part. And then before I forget as well, is there anyone else here from support groups? I know that I've got this young lady here from Naranon. Anyone else?
I'm with Sherry.
You are? Okay. So we have two ladies here, and you're from Naranon as well? Okay, so we have two ladies here from Naranon. And I'll conclude this evening by talking a little bit about 12-step groups. I didn't bring the 12 steps and 12 traditions, but I brought a couple things. So I want to make sure that everyone here knows that these two ladies have volunteered to be here this evening for the programming because they coordinate support groups that are actually like a part of the history of drug and alcohol treatment. Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon, Narcotics Anonymous and Naranon are 2 or 4 like really rich support systems in the history of drug and alcohol treatment. So the fact that they're here is amazing. So if you're curious and want to know more information about their group, they also have some information out front that you could access. So thank you, for being here, because that's a really important thing. As I mentioned last week, I always advocate that families go to Al-Anon meetings or go to Naranon meetings. As a matter of fact, when I teach family counseling in the fall and the spring semester, I have my students go to an Al-Anon meeting or a Naranon meeting, because those that want to become family therapists, I'm like, you can't be a good family therapist if you've never been to this meeting, then you don't know how to make a good, healthy referral for someone to go to Al-Anon or to go to Naranon. So I'm very supportive of the participation, with a qualifier, obviously, to like be part of that particular group.
I'm sorry, can you explain the difference between those two? What is Al-Anon and Ar-Anon?
Oh, sure. They're basically parallel organizations. You've got Alcoholics Anonymous, and then Alcoholics Anonymous has a group for people. Well, it's not Alcoholics Anonymous, but there's a group connected to Alcoholics Anonymous in the sense of participation. That if your life has been impacted by someone whose life is, disrupted, as a result of consuming alcohol, then that's a support group, Al-Anon. So it parallels Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a 12-step support group for people who only have the desire to stop drinking, and then Al-Anon, and then same thing for Narcotics Anonymous and Naranon, exactly the same thing, same steps, etc. Being a qualifier, the only requirement for membership is just that your life is impacted by someone that has alcoholism or substance use disorder.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking. It's an important question. So I love talking about it whenever I work in residential inpatient treatment, because clients that are in residential treatment think that Al-Anon and Naranon is where your family gets together to talk about you and complain about you. And then whenever I explain to them, like, oh, no, they're there learning how to do without you, and they're learning how to come up with some guidelines and some boundaries and say, hey, like, you do you, but like, I'm going to do this, and this is my recovery journey, this is what I'm doing. So they're always shocked, to find out that people aren't sitting around talking about them, but that's not the case. So anyway, back to this 4-stage model. I want to go through this a little bit, just initially to kind of go through the models so it makes sense to you. And then I didn't do half bad drawing without looking at my cheat sheet, but I'm going to kind of walk through the different components of it, and then we'll talk about time frames, and then we'll talk about belief systems or tapes or cognitions that people have in their mind. All right. So this little tube here looks like spaghetti. Let's go in this direction. That is what Stephanie Brown refers to as the addiction. So it's sometimes also referred to as the addiction axis. Has anybody ever heard of Jelinek before, or E.M. Jelinek? Ring a bell? So Jelinek, you've probably seen this before if you've ever seen a model, and Jelinek has, it's called a Jelinek curve. He was a really early person that worked in the field. Rutgers has a Center for Study on Alcoholism. Prior to that, it was at Yale University. So we're talking the 1940s and 50s, Ian Jelinek. So what he did is that he kind of categorized the downward spiral of a person with an active, in this case it was alcoholism, they didn't talk about drugs in the 40s and 50s, but of a downward spiral of alcoholism. And then the beautiful thing is that then this end of it captures all the positives that come with sobriety, right? Either the person has achieved sobriety, and then they're kind of getting their life put back together again. So just think about this as the addiction axis. So this little tube of spaghetti here that's running through the middle is the addiction. So 2 things to point out whenever you look at the model, if I've drawn it correctly, and I didn't even bring my glasses with me, so I'm hoping it looks right. The 2 things are this. 1, you notice that the addiction never disappears, right? And so that's one of the reasons why in the language that we use in the field, we never say that someone is recovered, that I'm a recovered alcoholic, because that implies that it's done and it's over. The correct terminology that we use in the field is recovering, because the person is always recovering from their substance use disorder, right? It would be the same thing if you draw a parallel to someone who has diabetes and someone who has, some other sort of disease entity. I talked about this last week that whereas diabetes could be referred to as a disease of the pancreas, then we think of substance use disorders as being a disease of the brain, cardiovascular disease, etc. So that's one important point, is that it never disappears. It's always with the person. And that's why abstinence, I believe strongly in abstinence. I've never seen non-abstinence work. The only time I've ever seen non-abstinence work is whenever the person didn't have a substance use disorder, right? Sometimes people falsely get diagnosed with a substance use disorder, but I've never encountered or worked with anyone that truly had a substance use disorder that was able to, after a period of time, stop being abstinent and being sober and successfully return to using their drug of choice, whatever that may be, or some other drug of choice, because my experience has always been that brings them right back, or else it develops a new drug of choice for that individual. Does that make sense? And so that's the, now when you're working in the field, clients are really anxious for that to be an opportunity or like a reality, right? I wasn't being facetious because it's a true expression, but it's, California sober, if you've heard that expression before, is like extremely problematic. Because a couple people in pop culture are like, oh, weren't you just in rehab last month? And like, oh yeah, like I don't, do this anymore, but I still drink and get high every once in a while. Like for me, like there's no way. I guess I will date myself out of the field if it ever changes to where smoking a little bit of weed and drinking is okay if you have an addiction, because I've never seen it work in the 40 years that I've worked in the field. I've never seen that work. I've never seen it work. So that's one of the things that's important, is you notice it never disappears. And if I drew it correctly, then the other thing that you notice too is like the addiction axis ends up higher on this end than it is on the other end. When I talk with patients or clients, I always really stress this for them. They don't get it at the time, but now I have contact with people that have 6, 10, 16 years of recovery. And one in particular who I just used as a trainer not very long ago. It's like, gone on to get their master's degree in counseling and has maintained sobriety for all this time, and now is a big champion for people in recovery. But said, like, when you told me like a long time ago, like someday that I would be really proud to be a person in recovery. She's like, I was kind of like, oh, he's kind of off it, isn't he? Because like, how could you ever be proud to be a person in recovery? And she said somewhere around like year 3 or 4, whenever we didn't have contact, in her recovery journey, she said all of a sudden it became who I am, and I became incredibly proud of the fact that I was a person in recovery. And it's a real parallel process, I think, for families as well, because we have so much stigma and we have so much shame-based thinking about having someone in your family that has a substance use disorder. And I think one of the things that I know for sure, again, from working in the field for so long, is once you start a conversation with someone and you open up the door and say like, oh, we have this issue, or et cetera, then you've opened up that door, and you will be surprised when that individual says like, oh, like, I've never talked with you about this before, but like, here's someone in my family that's struggling with this, and here's somebody else that's struggling with this. And did you know, the reason that Uncle Larry never drinks whenever he's, at our Memorial Day picnic is because he's been in recovery for 15 years. So they're out there, right? They're out there everywhere, people in recovery. And so over time, people embrace that identity, families embrace the fact that, like, you're not gonna be able to keep it a secret anyway. Families definitely wanna keep it a secret, right? They don't want anybody to know. Particularly here, right? people don't want people to know. People that live here year round, in particular, and so I've always been very gentle. But it's like I think people already know. People already know, and you're just kind of like wishing that people didn't know. But in their journey, at some point in time, people can really embrace the fact that like, yes, I have a son, I have a spouse, I have whoever, they're in recovery. And in addition to that, I'm incredibly proud of them, because they're in recovery. It wasn't easy. It was a challenge. It was difficult, but like now we're in this really great place. And so that's I guess for everyone who has an active substance use disorder in their family, I guess that's my hope and wish for everyone, is that you get to that place where you've got that recovery and sobriety in your family, and then you can embrace it and be really proud of that person because of what they've accomplished. And then also what the family's accomplished, because the family plays a really important role in having your identified loved one get better. You play a really important role in that process. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So does that make sense with my tube spaghetti? These little swirly lines are environmental stressors. You'll see not too much distress here. Then it gets super. Actually, I didn't draw that very well. Should have been super. This is super just stressful, like right in here, right? And then things get better, a little bit stressful here, and then better and better. So those are just environmental actions or stressors. I can give you a good example. So, and this is always a surprise whenever people are early in recovery and they're sort of on that pink cloud or that honeymoon phase, that they think like, oh, like, I just completed treatment, I did my 90 days in 90 days, I did 6 months of sober living, life is beautiful. Like, now that I have like addressed that, I'm on a person in recovery, like I'm not gonna have any problems anymore in life. Ooh, not necessarily true, right? Because there's some problems that follow you into recovery. And yes, you may have done everything that you needed to do, you were supposed to do, and you're a rock star as a person in recovery, but there are some things that still may follow you like over time. And those could be, obviously legal issues can follow you, financial issues can follow you, familial cutoff and familial stress, those kinds of things can follow you as well, and can be a challenge for that person. And then that ends up being a little bit of a shock or surprise, because you're thinking like, gosh, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, etc. And then like this came out of nowhere. It's also a time when your loved one is at great risk for returning to use. The term that we don't use is relapse, because relapse is sort of a judgmental term, but the current appropriate term is to say for that person to return to use. So that stressful period that comes is one of those times whenever a person is at greater risk. Have you all ever heard the expression halt before? So some of you have heard the expression halt before. So halt. This applies to your loved one that has a substance use disorder, and it also applies to you as a family member. The HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. That's when our lives were at most risk of potentially returning to use, potentially making a bad decision, potentially losing our cool and yelling at our loved one, as opposed to maintaining our boundaries and being professional. But it's easy to lose it. And you can relate to that, right? There's an expression for it, hangry, right? Where you combine the two. But hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Those are times when your loved one, and then also you, have to be particularly careful, because that's when it can be particularly problematic and difficult. Does that kind of make sense? That you always have to want to be careful about that. And then the last thing before we move on, see this green line that's going this way? And then you see it coming over here that's like this, it cuts in and expands out, cuts in and expands out. That's the person's frame of reference or their relationship with reality. And so if you notice, we haven't even gotten into descriptions yet, you see that this person, as they're moving to this period here, they are pretty open, and then they're increasingly distorting reality. That makes sense? So this person's distorting reality. Actually, should be even closer to about that. So I can't remember if I used this example last week, but one of the first clients that I ever worked with, all those years ago, had this many DUIs, right? That many DUIs. And had just been, and had been in a coma because the person was intoxicated and got run over in a parking lot and been in a coma for multiple months. And so I'm thinking, even though young and naive, because we all talk about consequences and the importance of consequences, and I was like, yeah. So I was doing a group, and I was thinking this person's going to be like my home run, because I'm going to say talk to me about the negative consequences, in your life as a result of, of your using. And the person's like, I can't think of anything. I was like, wait, did I read it wrong? I'm like, I thought you had this many, DUIs. So I'm like, okay, I'll just go around the room again. Other people were sharing what the consequence was, or something negative that happened as a result of their use. Came back around again. I'm like, I'm positive. I'm like, you don't have anything? And then finally, I was like, for some reason, I thought maybe you had a DUI or two. And the response was like, well, the first one, I feel like the police officer was out to get me. And then number 2 and number 3, or number 2 I got expunged, number 3 and 4 were so close together that I'm trying to get them treated as the same one. And then this one, so there was a rationale for each one of them as to why it wasn't that person's fault. That is the most perfect example of this, right? That's being on a lifeboat that's sinking and saying everything's going to be fine. Get out the game board. Let's play Monopoly. Everything's going to be fine. Nothing to worry about. There's a hole. Water's coming in. It's sinking. Everybody knows that it's sinking, right? Everybody knows that it's sinking. It's the elephant in the living room, to use Marion Tippo's expression for alcoholism in the family. Everyone knows. But that person, again, right, because they're not being deceitful and devious, but it's, as we talked about, their brain trying to create another opportunity to use. And so that's and it sounds almost like it can't be true that somebody would really not see it, but it's very, very typical. And so you may have some of your own examples that are kind of going through your head of something that that a friend or a loved one may have stated that's like, what? How could that possibly be? There's no way that you don't see that that's a problem, right?
I don't understand the symbolism of it starting out wide and getting small.
Because it starts out wide because then the person's open to reality, and they're open to reality and open to feedback, etc. And then it kind of parallels. Another way to think about it is blinders. I talk about it a lot. Like when you're at that point, you're like leading your life like a horse with blinders on, right? It's there. The car is there. the noise, whatever, it's all there, but like, I don't see it, I don't see it, I don't see it, I don't see it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so it's open to begin with because you're open to feedback. At this point in time, you could say, hey, I'm kind of concerned, you're worrying me, etc. And the person would be open to it. Whenever you get to this point in time, as they're going in that direction, they have to distort reality so much to keep using that logic completely disappears. That's when family members get super frustrated because they're like, who is this person? Where did this person come from? How in the world do you think what you're thinking? It just isn't true, right? See where you layer in hungry, angry, lonely, tired, and then it's like, and then the worst possible thing is to engage to engage that person and get into, some heated conversation or conflict, because you're never gonna win, right? Because you're up against this, disease entity, they're distorting reality. And then it gives them it gives them the card to play. It's like, oh, you should probably work on your attitude, or you have an anger problem. You should probably see a counselor about your anger problem. That'll come out of the person's mouth. Some of you are nodding your heads, and maybe you've heard that before. That's exactly what will come out of their mouth. Like, calm down. You've got an anger problem. So, but you're angry because you're like, well, you're killing yourself, number one, and this makes no sense. Nobody would think this is a rational way to operate. So this essentially right here is the term that we use, you've heard before, of hitting bottom. So this place right here is where the person has hit bottom, and then that's the golden opportunity for the recovery journey or process to begin. And we'll talk a little bit more about that this evening as well, because you as a friend or a loved one can play an important role in kind of facilitating that person hitting bottom by pulling away whatever kind of safety nets or enabling behavior or support or water wings or whatever it may be. Like that person needs to start, feeling that they're going down and sinking in order to have the aha moment to contemplate getting better. So this is hitting bottom. We're moving in this direction. You see things are getting better. And I'll just go ahead and jump to this. Historically, in early recovery, someone and the family is going to have, during that very first year, there's going to be some stressful event that happens. Some stressful event's going to happen, which is going to kind of catch everybody off guard. And so it's interesting because it usually happens somewhere between 6 and 9 months is where that thing happens. And it varies depending on what it is, but something happens within that time frame. It's a potential time for your loved one or friend to contemplate returning to use. And then it's also could be a really frustrating time for the family, thinking oh, we've done all this work and it feels like things are falling apart again. It easily can happen more than once, but it's definitely going to happen once within that first time frame. Right? So let's do this. Speaking of time frames, we'll talk about this. So there are 4 different stages to the model that Stephanie Brown created, 4 different stages. First one is the using stage. And so in the using stage, a time frame can be pretty lengthy or pretty short. It really kind of depends upon the drug of choice, right? That it takes for that person before they get to the next stage. So, with something as common and simple as alcohol, it could be, it could be this to 30 years, maybe longer, right? It could be a long period of time. With some other substances, and you all have, heard about other substances where the person's, and I guess though I'm talking about the use moving from being recreational / prescription / normal, whatever that is, to becoming problematic, right? And so we were just talking about this. I don't know if I talked about it here, but I was talking with someone else about this recently about pain medication when someone gets injured, and how someone can get injured and you get prescribed a pain medication, and then the person, some people can take that pain medication and then they're off the pain medication whenever it's time to be off it. PRN prescriptions are particularly not good because that's a good starting point when you give someone a PRN. And you all know what that means, right? PRN. So PRN prescription is whenever it's not scheduled that you'd like take it twice a day or once a day, et cetera. It's like it essentially means take as needed. That's a bad thing to give to someone who potentially has a positive family history or has a substance use disorder, because take as needed is not a good idea. So anyway, that can be a pretty short journey, right? That can be a pretty short journey. Someone that hasn't had, an issue with alcoholism or any other kind of process-related addictions, hurts their back, maybe they fell while they were running, get prescribed a narcotic pain medication, and then takes off, right? The person likes the way that narcotic pain medication feels, and then they use it, and then they keep increasing the amount that they use, and then they've got to find another physician to write them a script, and then over time, then that results in someone getting that narcotic off the street, which is risky and dangerous, and then usually that's going to involve either snorting it or else using a needle to inject it. And I mean, I've worked with so many people over the years that said, I'm terrified of needles. The thought of ever putting a needle in my arm was something I would never ever do ever in my entire life, yet here I am, right? And that's because it's driven by the brain. It's driven by the brain in terms of like wanting to get that cellular sense back, that cellular craving to get that drug of choice in your system. So I think that's a really important thing to kind of embrace and to realize, is that when people have a substance use disorder, they're doing things that upset you. They're also doing things that they're terrified of that they otherwise wouldn't typically do, and it scares them as well whenever they like have brief moments where they see the reality of their life and like what's going on in their life, because they're not excited about that either. You have a fear of needles, you got a fear of needles, right? That doesn't ever go away, right? So does this kind of make sense that this could be 30? And I got the impression from looking at your faces that you also think this could be longer, right? It could be a longer period of time, right? It just depends. But it could also be short. It could be short depending upon the drug of choice. So anyway, that's the using period. The transition period, and so this would be the time frame for this. The transition period, and I'll give you kind of a description of what that would be. I think that usually, if you're lucky, kind of like fits into this time frame. You'll see why here in a couple minutes. It could be 1 to 5 plus. And I'm gonna kind of go through in a moment and talk with you about the cognitions and what goes on in the brain. Early recovery is like 1 to 3, and then ongoing recovery is like 3 to 4 plus. So let me kind of talk about, I think I'll just go ahead and move to the cognitions now, because I think that'll make more sense as I kind of like work my way through it. So this is the belief system here. I'm going to abbreviate. So oops, sorry about that. So these are the cognitions, and one of the things that's really interesting about this, it got Stephanie Brown in a little bit of trouble, like being a member of the recovering community, because as we work our way through this, you'll see that what she's suggesting, what happens in the transition stage, is that recovery cognitively begins while behaviorally the person is still using. And so if you're gonna be like 100% old school, recovery doesn't begin until you've like hit bottom and you've hit abstinence, and then you're maintaining sobriety. But in her mind, and it makes perfect sense to me, and oh my gosh, do clients completely relate to this idea, that it is a process, it isn't necessarily like that, and it explains a lot of what happens with individuals. So the belief system, the cognitions, or the belief system, or the tape that's in a person's head when they're in the using stage is, I'm not an addict or an alcoholic, and I can control my use. Let me show you how I can do it. We talked about this last week, right? Your loved ones or friends may at some point in time say, hey, just watch me. I'm not gonna have anything to drink for the next 5 weeks. And they can do it, right? And then at the end of that 5 weeks, they can say like, see, I don't have a problem. You have a problem, right? Remember we talked about you and your anchor problem? Have you been to your counseling appointment? I just did 5 weeks without drinking or using anything. So that is their belief system. I don't have a problem and I can completely control my use. In reality, if a person can control their use and they're using as long as it's not problematic, then that person doesn't have a substance use disorder, right? That person's not an alcoholic or not an addict. It's what happens whenever the person moves into the next stage or the transition stage where they have problematic use, they're continuing to use despite negative consequences. And here the cognition at the beginning part is, it's switched from I'm not to like, oh yes, I am an alcoholic, I am an addict, right? I am a gambling addict, I'm a shopping addict, I have a food addiction, whatever it may be. Like, yes, that's me, but I can control it. Let me show you how I can control it. And that is most often evidenced by a but. And so if you are saying, or if a treatment professional says to someone like, I need you, and we'll talk about like aftercare as a good example, or maybe even going to treatment. Oh, let's use going to treatment as an example. Like, we need you to go to treatment. The person will say like, well, I will go see a counselor, I will go to meetings, but I won't go to treatment. That's that person trying to still control their addiction, because what that does is it gives them the opportunity to use, they're protecting the opportunity to use again by not following all treatment recommendations. After a person has completed treatment, what we typically see is that the person will say like, okay, like I'm done, like, I'm gonna go to meetings, but I'm not gonna get a sponsor. Or I'm gonna go to meetings, but I'm not gonna work the steps. Or I'm going to go to meetings, but I'm not going to go to IOP. Or I desperately need to go to long-term sober living, so I'll go see a counselor, and I've had people say this, where I'll go see a counselor, but I won't, go to sober living. So anytime there's a but in there, and this explains a lot, right? Because this is a person that will be at a meeting and stand up and say like, hi, I'm Gerard and I'm an alcoholic, and then get in their car and then drive and get something at the liquor store on the way home. Because they can say, this is who I am, but that's where California sober gets inserted, right? Yeah, I go to meetings, but I'll drink a little bit every once in a while. Wouldn't be approved of or accepted, right? And so anything that the person does that doesn't follow the prescription or the recommendation to save that person's life, that's the other part that's super important. That prescription is to save that person's life. And so they're still saying, yeah, I'll do everything. I'll do everything, but I won't do that. And when you hear that coming out of a person's mouth, that means they're here, and that means that they need to be driven towards and pushed towards hitting bottom to get more consequences. Because that's the only thing that's going to get that person to accept, I am an alcoholic, I am an addict, and I cannot control it. It controls me. And so that's the role that professionals play, that's the role that family members play, is like getting that person to get to transition as two parts. If you stay here, you're going to return to use. You're going to stay sober for a certain period of time, maybe 3-4 months. I'm not gonna use, I'm not gonna drink, I'm not gonna do whatever, I'm not gonna gamble. I'm not gonna engage in this, but then after a while, you'll be right back there.
So you have to hit bottom.
Yes, yeah. And I know it sounds, hitting bottom seems like hitting bottom seems like it has to be like thunder and lightning and something horrible. It does not. And I can tell you, I used to do interventions, and nobody ever wanted a kid in an intervention, and I was like, oh, I want your kid there. Oh, this child was only like 7 years old. Like, I want them there, because everybody else can say, you've got a problem. I'm going to leave you. You're going to lose your job. I'm going to file for divorce, etc. All it takes is a 7-year-old to say, you scare me whenever you drink. Boom. That's this. So it doesn't have to be this huge. Kind of not a fan. If any of you ever watched Intervention when they have the program on TV, personally, I'm not a fan. I'm only a fan if it helped people to see what the process looked like. I didn't like it because it felt like it was reality TV and it served as entertainment for others. And so like I had to draw like for myself like a moral line saying like this just doesn't feel right for other people's pain and misery to be a reality TV show. In the hopes that maybe some people were inspired and it helped them get there together as a family to do an intervention, I guess that would counterbalance it. But for me, it just never felt right. And I'm sorry, you had a question.
No, what about the individual that doesn't want the help, doesn't want the recovery, won't get the,
So that's common, and it's really a matter of like finding out as a family, what you can do to like pull away, like support, etc.
I have all.
And
He's been living homeless for years.
And sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes that happens.
But then also the other things, the mental illness starts growing and becoming worse.
And that could be co-occurring disorders, or that's the expression, that we use whenever someone has a substance use disorder, and then they have something else that's going on, whether it's depression or, whether it's, bipolar disorder, whatever it may be. And so that really, really complicates matters. It makes it harder for that person to find sobriety because they've got other challenges that are going on. But it's possible. It's possible.
There's always hope.
There's always hope. And I think I used this example, last week when I either talking with you or maybe I was talking with someone, but I had a family that I was working with years ago, and they kept on saying like, oh, we need to do this, oh, we need to do this, oh, we need to do everything that you say, but our daughter keeps on saying, well, I'll kill myself, if you make me go to treatment, or I'll kill myself, if you make me go to sober living. And I said, you know what, she's gonna die. She's either gonna, and I thought it was all, I thought she was just, it wasn't a cry for help, it was, I could like see, because I had the pleasure of seeing this person, like, oh, like, you're really good, because I just watched the interaction, and it's like, oh, you totally have them wrapped around your finger. I mean, it's, particularly with mental health stuff, it's a judgment call. You don't want to facilitate that. But then what ended up happening is, about like 8 months later, she died from an overdose, right? And then they were distraught and upset. It's harder for me because I don't want to be like, but, you could have gotten your child into treatment. You could have said, we won't come pick you up. We will not buy you a plane ticket. We will not pay for this. To kind of push them in the direction, of seeing I don't have any resources, and so it's difficult. It's very difficult. But all I can tell you is that it works. It works. If you've got to find out, and maybe sometimes it's getting, some suggestions or some input from other people, which is kind of hard, right, for us to take our lives and to put them out here like this and like look at them, or have somebody else look at our life from this 360 perspective and say, I think this behavior that you're doing is contributing to it, or I think this is contributing to it. Those are tough conversations. That's why you need Narnon, that's why you need Al-Anon, because you've got support, because you've got people that have gone through the same thing. Doesn't matter what the drug of choice was, doesn't matter the age of the person, the relationship, etc. They've gone through the same process of, the pain and the difficulty, and are learning how to be with boundaries, learning how to like take care of themselves, like and move forward and find health and well-being for self. and part of that is because we're not socialized to think of ourselves and taking care of ourselves. We're socialized to take care of others, right? And so that's why it's so difficult, because you go, I'm going to be a bad person if I'm not doing everything I can to help this person. Because oftentimes many of the things that you're doing to help are actually hurting.
Correct.
And so it's tricky.
When you come to one of these groups like Naranon and Al-Anon, you think you're gonna fix your addict.
Yes.
You know, that we're gonna sit around and we're gonna give you the formula to fix your addict, you know? And what you end up doing is finding out that you're fixing yourself and how you're interacting with your addict.
100%.
You know, but that separation and, you know, it's very hard to do.
It is.
And that's why
I
you need support.
Yes.
And that's why you need people to tell you their experience so that you can feed off of their positive, you know, actions. But I do have a question about the mental health issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
I am of the belief, because of what my experience was, that people don't start overindulging or using or whatever unless something happened to make them, to trigger that. Unless they have some kind of mental health issue or trauma or whatever.
Right.
And luckily in my addict's experience, after the third time at rehab, discovered that she wanted to go to a dual diagnosis rehab. And she wanted to focus on the why. Why am I using, why am I trying to escape this?
Right.
Do they talk about, I mean, does that make sense to you? I mean, it worked for her.
Okay.
It worked for her.
So a couple things. One, I mean, thank you for the question, because that's a great question for everybody to hear. There's multiple pathways. There's multiple pathways to developing an addiction. As I mentioned, it has a fancy name for it, the one I just described earlier about the prescription medication. That's called iatrogenic, which is a fancy way of saying physician-induced. Physicians don't like to hear that, but it can be physician-induced, right? As a result of an accident. It could be a result of trauma. It could be a result of trauma in a person's life. You know, trauma is something that I think we're slowly learning more and more about, how trauma is completely like the disease of addiction. Trauma is like ingrained in our brains because we have trauma responses to triggers that are out in the environment. So if you have PTSD or you have a history of trauma, there's a variety of different types of trauma a person can experience. Sometimes it doesn't take very much at all for that individual to physically relive that trauma experience. I mean, it can be from as far out as physical abuse and sexual abuse to a car accident. And so people can be easily triggered, and then, you know, if they have a positive family history, or even if they've never even used substances before, when a person discovers that whatever I drank or whatever I took takes away that horrible feeling that I got, where it feels like I'm sinking in the ground and the whole world is collapsing around me, they're like, I don't care what anybody says, but that took away the terrifying experience that I had. So mental health issues, become the same thing. That can be like a gateway for an individual. For instance, depression, it makes no sense, right, to medicate a depression, but a lot of people with depression medicate their depression with central nervous system depressants, which are benzodiazepines, Valium, Ativan, Librium, those goodies that the doctors are more than happy to pass out, or beverage alcohol. So the person has depression and they're using central nervous system depressants to treat their depression, then they're making themselves more depressed in that process, right? Bipolar, etc. People medicate themselves if they're in manic moods or if they're depressed, and so there's a lot of self-medication that comes. It could come from trauma, it could come from a mental health diagnosis. Then all that does is just complicate